Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 70. Tony and Soldier. Tony had wasted no time in contacting Fury after the little tete-a-tete with Frigga and company. He still didn't like or trust the man, but Tony was willing to admit Fury did have his uses, and his government contacts around the world were definitely one of them. The fact that Tony now had the man over a barrel where S.H.I.E.L.D. was concerned would hopefully keep Fury's manipulative tendencies to a dull roar. To his credit, Fury had been surprisingly civil and had confirmed he'd already been in touch with a few of his contacts and would be in contact with the rest within the week. What they would do with the information was anyone's guess. Tony, for one, had no compunctions about sicking Fury, Steve, and or Loki, whatever combo would work best, on any of the governments that got stubborn or asshole-ish. Keeping humankind, and from there all life, from being wiped out was a lot more important than petty political games or whatever other bugs they had up their butts. That done, Tony had more or less locked himself in his lab to start designing and coding a new arm for Barnes. Bruce had invited himself in early on, not that Tony had minded in the least, or, to be honest, even noticed at first, which was saying something. Ever since Sane, he'd gotten better at taking stock of his surroundings, even in the midst of an inventing bender. He wasn't anywhere near perfect at it. He still got sucked in pretty easily, but he was better than he had been. He'd actually called Cecilia in towards the end of the first day. She didn't know coding from a hole in the ground, but she knew medical stuff, and between her and Bruce, Tony was able to find out what he needed. The new arm was, from the outside, virtually identical to the arms on the suits, though Tony had opted for plain metal rather than any one color or the other. He could always paint the thing when Barnes got far enough to express an opinion about it. Like with the suit, there were panels on the outside of the upper arm and the top of the forearm where stuff could be installed later. Whether stuff was guns or something else would be up to Barnes. Internally, though, there were a number of differences. The first being that there was the equivalent of bones running through the arm, though much thinner than the actual bones in a real arm, to house or protect the electronics that ran the whole thing, rather than the electronics being just behind the metal panels, like in the suit. The whole thing was also about half the weight of the original, even if Tony used earth metals and alloys. If he could work the Asgard stuff, he might find a lighter alternative. Tony had improved on the coding from the original arm. That one had provided pressure sensors only in the palm and fingertips. Worse, the sensors had been purpose-calibrated. Barnes's trigger fingertip had far more sensitivity than the rest. The rest of the palm and fingertips had enough sensitivity to not accidentally crush, say, a hand or arm when Barnes grabbed them with the arm, but that was about it. What pissed Tony off was that it being that way had to be deliberate. As much as he hated to admit it, the arm was a work of art, and if they could calibrate one fingertip so finely, they could damn well have done the rest the same. But they hadn't. Tony had managed to wire the entire hand, not just for pressure, but temperature, and had calibrated everything so Barnes would be able to hold anything he wanted without crushing it. He also put pressure sensors at intervals along the rest of the length of the arm. That would allow Barnes to take a swing at someone and control the strength of the swing as much as he wanted. He'd also be able to tell if the arm had taken damage or was about to if he was using it as a doorstop or otherwise had it jammed in somewhere it might get crushed. There weren't anywhere near as many sensors in the rest of the arm as in the hands, and the calibration was completely different, but it wasn't like he was going to be picking up an egg with his bicep or something. The power source was an arc reactor, of course. Tony had decided to surround it with adamantium panels to protect it. He sincerely doubted that Barnes would be able or willing for combat for a long time, but that did not mean something wouldn't happen to wreck the arm. An arc reactor going kablooey due to damage would... yeah, that would be bad. So it was best to do what he could to make sure the thing didn't get wrecked that way. All that finally done, Tony had constructed a mobile Faraday cage. While the assholes had stopped trying to blow Barnes up via remote, Tony was taking no chances that they'd start up again. Though getting Barnes in the thing was going to be interesting. Barnes had been showing more life by the hour, according to Jarvis. He still wasn't remembering anything, as far as they could tell, though. According to Jarvis, Barnes was still giving Steve, "Who are you?" sort of looks, and given how much of their lives had been lived side by side, Tony was betting that Steve would be one of the first things Barnes remembered, if not the first. That said, Barnes might not remember who Steve was yet, but he for sure had figured out that Steve was someone he could trust. Barnes started shaking like a leaf when anyone but Steve got within about 10 feet of him. He was also apparently reluctant to take food or water from anyone else. He still took them, but he was a lot slower about it than if it was Steve handing him things. Needless to say, Steve had been all but surgically attached to Barnes' side for the last 2 days, and completely focused on Barnes to the exclusion of just about everything else, for which Tony was deeply grateful. Because Jarvis had names and places now. Not a lot, just 2 or 3, but it was somewhere to start. Tony wasn't going to say a thing to Steve about it until they got back from the tour of the realms. He knew as sure as his name was Tony Stark that Steve would want to go out and bust heads together. Not that Tony blamed the man a bit, or didn't want to join in on the fun. But they had more important things to deal with first. Once they got the realms ball rolling, they could deal with the don't know they're dead men yet brigade. Things were beginning to make sense. Sort of. Maybe. A little bit. At least Soldier was starting to remember the names of things that he hadn't a couple days ago. Like the fact that the thing on the bed was in fact a quilt. Better written words were starting to make sense. That first day, the writing on the bottle of drink and the wrapper for the food bar had been just gibberish. Now he knew the bars were power bars, and the drink was Gatorade. Some of the words on both still didn't make sense, but Barnes decided it was less a function of him not remembering anything and more the words just being weird as hell. What was monopotassium phosphate? And that was just one of the weird words he'd spotted on both packages. After that first attempt to get him to eat and drink, the Avengers had stopped by every hour or so that he was awake with more. Soldier eventually figured out it was their way of making sure he didn't make himself sick. Not because he figured that out on his own, but because he heard one of them mention it before the door closed, cutting him off from what happened outside the room he was in. He wasn't sure why he'd get sick from eating and drinking, but if they wanted to be worried about it, there was nothing he could do to stop them. In a weird way, it was actually kind of nice. They all seemed very invested in him not being afraid, in pain, or sick. His previous controllers hadn't given a crap one way or the other most of the time, and if the bits and flashes he got every now and again were things that had actually happened, they'd actively damaged him on more than one occasion. Rogers was there virtually non-stop. There'd been a few hours when he wasn't, which had made Soldier inexplicably uneasy. For some reason, Soldier trusted the guy, which made no sense whatever, but there it was. Loki was there every single time someone else was. His energy trick, whatever it was, evidently necessary for the others to be willing to be in the room with them. It was an improvement over a load of guns and shock sticks, to be sure. Better still, not a one of them so much as said a cross word to him, never mind hurting him. It was like a vacation. What was a vacation? Now, though, it seemed like they were all gearing up for something. There was a lot of going and coming in and out of the room he was in, and hushed voice conversations at the far end of the room, where he wasn't able to overhear what they were saying. Eventually, Steve came and hunkered down a few feet away, arms propped on his knees, big, earnest blue eyes fixed on Soldier. Why was that expression so familiar? Come to think of it, why was the name Steve so familiar? It was enough to drive him crazier than he already was. Okay, so, here's the thing. We want to help you, Steve told him. The people who had you were not nice. And if the expression on Steve's face was anything to go by, the guy had wanted to say something a whole lot stronger than not nice. The biggest problem is the arm. We don't know what they've done to it or what it's capable of. Tony Stark has come up with a safer arm for you, but in order to switch them out, we need to get you out of here. And that's where the second problem comes in. Soldier rather appreciated that Steve explained stuff like Soldier had a brain in his head, even if what he was talking about made Soldier twitchy. Take his arm off? Replace it? The very idea made his guts twist uncomfortably, made fear and bile choke the back of his throat. Those people, well, they made sure they could destroy you if you escaped them. You've got explosives in you that are remote controlled. The only reason you're still alive is because this room is shielded against incoming and outgoing transmissions of any kind. In order to get you where we need to, in order to... Steve waved one hand slightly, obviously restraining himself from a bigger gesture. Fix their mess. We need you to move into a much smaller space for a little bit. It's designed to keep the transmissions from reaching you. The door opened and Loki, who'd been standing near it, pushed himself off the wall, hands flexing in warning. Just beyond the open door was, well, a goldish red-colored cage of some sort of mesh. Soldier appreciated the distraction. It didn't let him think too much about the whole explosives in your body thing. I'll be in there with you. This isn't a trap or a way for us to hurt you. They'd have to trap or hurt me too. Soldier knew well that if they were desperate enough, hurting Steve wouldn't fuss them too much if it got him dead. That said, they hadn't once seemed that desperate. Some of them might be that good at acting, but not all of them. Will you come? Steve asked. He got to his feet, moving slow and steady, in a way that didn't make Soldier feel panicky. He held a hand out in an apparently automatic offer to help Soldier up off the floor. Soldier's world went sideways for half a second. There was a sudden split-second impression of cold and wind and terror, a flash of... Steve? In the colorful outfit, face twisted in concern as he reached out and down towards Soldier. The sensation of falling. As fast as it came, it was gone, leaving 10,000 questions in its wake, as well as a trail of cold sweat down his spine and an inexplicable quiver of terror that wanted to be let out. Thankfully, Steve seemed to have frozen in place, evidently startled that he'd offered his hand, and probably wondering what Soldier would do about it. After a long moment's hesitation, Soldier took the offered hand with his flesh one and let Steve haul him to his feet. It wasn't until they were both in the cage and it was being rolled towards an elevator that Soldier realized he still hadn't let go of that hand. Even when he noticed it, he couldn't make himself turn loose. Even thinking about it brought back that flash of... Well, whether it was a real memory or not didn't matter, really. It still scared the crap out of him in a way nothing had since he'd thrown off the drugs he'd been being given.